Wean to harvest biosecurity is a complex issue for the U.S. pork supply chain that has been developing for many years. But what are some cost effective, innovative solutions to address this significant biosecurity gap in U.S. swine production? Welcome to the Global Hog Industry Virtual Conference Update. I'm Ann Hess with National Hog Farmer. Joining us for this next session, closing the wean to harvest biosecurity gap, is Paul Sundberg, Swine Health Information Center Executive Director, Elise Toohill, veterinarian with Carthage Veterinary Service, and Travis Ruth, Associate Director of Finishing with the Carthage System. Thank you all for joining us today. Paul, let's start the conversation with you. Over the years, data from the Swine Disease Monitoring Report and your recent APP investigation have expanded some deficiencies in wean to harvest biosecurity. How significant is this gap in biosecurity, and what have been some key findings from your investigations?
Yeah, I think the important point here, Ann, is just as you said, this is a complex issue that's been going on for quite a while. One of the foundations, one of the tenets of the Swine Health Information Center is to analyze industry data and take a look for weaknesses. And one program that we have is what we call rapid response teams that, on the invitation of producers, can go out and investigate the pathways of introduction of different diseases, different outbreaks on the farm. We did that with APP in the middle of Iowa, and it was pretty obvious where APP usually goes from the breeding herd to the finisher and moves that direction. This outbreak happened across finishing floors in multiple places at just about the same time. It was a real indication that something was going on there. As well, when we look at the data from our swine disease reporting system associated with the increase in outbreaks of PRRS or increase of finding PRRS and PED on finishing floors later, a little time later, that happens in the breeding herds. And when you go back and look at it, even back in the pseudorabies eradication days, we recognized real late in that program that if we didn't address biosecurity and pseudorabies vaccination and keep the finishing floors from breaking with the viral cloud of pseudorabies, that we would continue to reinfect the breeding herds. So there's a lot of circumstantial, but I think really good evidence to indicate that we need to address this as a circle of disease transmission. You can't just do finishing floors. You can't just do breeding herds. You have to do those in concert, and you have to do those together in order to have the most effectiveness you can on the health of the herd.
Absolutely, a system-wide approach. Elise, I imagine over the years the Carthage system has done its own investigations into biosecurity gaps, and I think you might have a visual here, but what are some problem areas Carthage has found in its supply chain, and what have you been doing to address those?
To identify problem areas, I think it's important that each individual site, producer, or system knows what their baseline is. Biosecurity can be incredibly overwhelming when we think about that as a whole. So if we can break it down to individual steps and then have a way to measure what our break rate is for various epidemic diseases, that helps us to know whether or not we are gaining ground or making progress, or the things that we're doing, if they're helping or not. And knowing which diseases you're breaking with may help guide what your problem areas are. So for example, if we're trying to reduce our PD break rate, I might focus more on fomite transmission versus potential aerosol transmission, which is more likely with PRRS. So I think you have to start with knowing what your problem is, start with measuring it, and then from there that leans into the specific problem areas. This visual here shows a fishbone diagram of all the various routes of introduction that a bacteria or virus can get into the farm. When we have an outbreak on a site, The industry tends to do this more with sow herds, but I think it's very valuable on finishing herds as well. Like Paul talked about, that we do some form of outbreak investigation, either with the veterinarian or a trained field person with that individual site, so that can lean into what were the most likely risk events and what were the most risky things that led to that outbreak. And then that can help the system as a whole as you go forward. When we look at finishing sites, the main areas we tend to focus on are the site location and the connections that that site has with other sites in the area. So whether that's people or equipment moving between those sites. We also really focus on mortality removal. Because dead animals carry a lot of bacteria and viruses, and depending on how our mortalities are handled, that can be a very large risk event. And then lastly, transport biosecurity, particularly market transport. As those trailers come back from the packing plants, they have a really large risk of bringing bacteria and viruses back to the farms. So those are the big areas that we tend to focus on as we're trying to reduce diseases on our finishing herds.
Very complex area for disease and virus and bacteria to get in. That was a great visual. Travis, let's turn to you. I understand you've had some success in tightening up some of those weak areas in biosecurity in the sites you work with. Can you detail for us some of the practices you've put in place and the outcomes from those?
Sure. Really the slat level on finishing, each site has to be looked at individually. And so our team is taking the approach to tailor a plan for each individual site and find which set of processes will fit best for that site and the facilities that are there. And then that plan is aligned with the owner of that site and or the caretaker. And then also our herd veterinarian, and then our production manager that oversees and helps the day-to-day operations with that contract grower or that caretaker. Outside of that, or after that's in place, really the next biggest thing is continual audit process of is that plan being followed on a day-to-day basis, and especially when we're on site and making a visit. And really, the key to all of that is training and education for the grower and or that caretaker, and making sure that they understand and have a good grasp of why each piece is important and what they can do to help limit that exposure at their site. And then really the final piece that we've done to help shore up those gaps is if we see something, say something and fix it right then. Don't wait and put it on a report and talk about it a week later. If there's a biosecurity violation, address it and educate on it and fix it.
Definitely see something, say something, and very tailored to sites. It makes the most sense here. Paul, big picture, it was announced last week that SHIC, along with the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research and Pork Checkoff, are now funding a wean to harvest biosecurity program to be implemented over the next 2 years. Can you tell us more about that program and the key research areas you hope to address?
Yeah, I sure can. So a little bit of background first. Each year, the Swine Health Information Center's Board of Directors approves a plan of work for that year and also an associated budget. And really, that's kind of a roadmap for what we're trying to get done for the next year. It gives us some guidelines to look at. What happened was our investigation in the APP outbreak in central Iowa, as well as looking at the data from the swine disease reporting system and other spots that help to point out this deficiency in finishing floor, really wean to harvest biosecurity, was brought to them in June. And we switched courses as we were running. They refocused our 2022 plan of work and reallocated money from the 2022 plan of work items to focus on wean to harvest biosecurity. And so that partnership that we have with FAR and with Checkoff is going to look at three main areas. If you take a look at the sites, the wean to harvest site, whether that's a nursery or grow finish or a finishing floor, or maybe anything in between, biosecurity is really an issue of bioexclusion, keeping things off of that site, as well as biocontainment. If you break with something, keep it on the site. So we're going to look at those two areas associated with sites. And then always there's this issue of transport biosecurity that has to come into play anytime you're talking about wean to harvest. And we use that term purposefully because the wean to harvest includes even the interactions with the packing plants and other first points of concentration. So this whole system that we've put together here of trying to put together research priorities and get those advertised as a call for proposals so we can go after the science of bioexclusion, biocontainment, and transport biosecurity. That was all put together as part of the responsiveness of SHIC and trying to focus on the industry needs right at this time. We've got two task forces that we've put together from across the industry in each of these areas, in the site and containment and exclusion, and then another one in transport. And our effort there is to make sure that as we look at the science and we develop a call for proposals and we look at research and programs that have to happen, that those are going to be applicable, that they're actually going to be usable. There's going to be a cost effectiveness to them. And we're excited that this is going to make a difference. It's going to be a long haul and it's going to be a push because it's not going to be an easy thing to get done. But I'm really excited about the opportunity to try to make a difference in this. And thanks to FAR and Checkoff for putting together their resources as well to give us plenty of resources to go after the problem.
Elise and Travis, I know within the Carthage system that you have some key areas you see for improvement, maybe in bioexclusion, biocontainment, and transportation, biosecurity. What are some next steps you're taking on the ground there? And I believe you have a few visuals as well as to add to that.
Yeah, I can speak to the bioexclusion side. Again, like Elise mentioned, a large focus on people entry and supply entry and then animal movements within the site. A lot of the facilities, especially in today's environment, aren't brand new. And a lot of these are 15, 20 years old that some remodels are necessary for us to have some of the layers of protection that we would want. So we've really had a lot of success with really, I think the root of it is we've done a good job at educating the folks that we work with around the importance of biosecurity and have had great success with getting some office remodels and some facility remodels in place to help limit the risk of exposure. And then again, continuing to evaluate the best spot for clean, dirty lines, personal vehicle sanitation, the way that any day-to-day or caretaker would enter the site, and then any visitors that would enter that site, whether it be the vet team or the someone from our team. And again, back to that biosecurity plan, really having a good roadmap that someone brand new to this facility and the setup can follow to make sure that they're not adding any risk to the equation.
Elise, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll take the next bucket of biocontainment. When we think about biocontainment, with biocontainment and bioexclusion, some of the practices that we do fit both of those buckets. But when I have a site that breaks with a disease, the first thing we like to do is start with area communication. Ideally, all of our sites would be in the middle of nowhere and have no connections to anybody else. But the reality is that's not how most of our finishing sites are set up. So if there's sites right next door, or particularly sow farms, for example, we do what we can to be a good neighbor and communicate with them so that they can consider potential cross traffic that they might have on the road or with employees or with equipment. And then we can work together to find ways to not continue to spread the disease throughout the area. The other big bucket I think about is mortality removal, because depending on how you are getting rid of those mortalities, you can contaminate the area or the system. So for example, rendering is a very popular practice on a lot of finishing sites. But if you're rendering from a PRRS positive site, that can make that the rendering truck a very, very high risk for the next site that it goes to potentially contaminate that site, depending on where that rendering box is located and how those mortalities are picked up, and then how the employees then interact with the site after bringing their mortalities to the bucket. So anything we can do to reduce the risk from a mortality perspective is helpful. Obviously, the pictures on the top left are the not ideal of having dead animals that are outside, exposed to rodents, exposed to varmints like raccoons and coyotes and vultures and eagles. Those are all, those animals are high risk to move viruses from one farm to another farm. So whether it's the rendering box or the compost, if there's things that we can do to get those mortalities completely covered with organic matter at the end of every day, so that they're not as much of a risk for wildlife and rodents to come in contact with them and then to go to other sites. All of those things are big focus areas. So we realize that not every situation not every site is feasible to build a really big, nice, fancy compost like I have pictured in the center of the graph. But this is where I think we have to work with veterinarians and producers, have to work together to think creatively. Each state has different requirements for what that compost is. So some states they don't have to be covered. Other states they do. So I think in the states where the laws aren't as stringent, things that we can do to build a smaller compost that's more cost effective have definitely been valuable in with our clients and with the system that we work with. If you can't avoid rendering at all, thinking about ways that you can reduce the number of pickups, or if you can use a larger container or like a roll-off dumpster, for example, or something else that minimizes the number of risk events. Those are other things that you can consider. You can also get creative and think about like central compost or central rendering locations that you might be able to use if you have a pod of sites or a group of producers in a nearby area. There's some pros and cons there that it's important to work through the risk benefit of that, but those are all things to start thinking about as you start to work down the biocontainment model. We can't forget between turn sanitation as well when we think about biocontainment, because obviously it's not ideal that we break with PRRS or PD this turn, but it's really bad if we break the next turn of pigs that come into the site with PRRS or PD as well. So I think a lot of people forget about hygiene and sanitation in between turns, or forget that that's actual biosecurity, and that's another important component of that as well.
Ann, I think that kind of points out that biosecurity, the thing about biosecurity is that you're only as good at biosecurity as your weakest moment. The biosecurity has to be a 24/7 every day of the year. And what we're trying to do with the program is acknowledge that there are implementation issues and making sure that, and there are issues with producers staying with that biosecurity, whatever biosecurity program it is, 24/7 all the time. So that's a people thing. What we're trying to do with the program is give these guys more tools, looking at the technology and the engineering and trying to think outside the box for cost-effective types of tools that they can use that maybe will overcome some of those personal implementation issues, make it easy to implement biosecurity all the time. And that's really going to be our focus with out of the box and cost-effective pieces of what can we do next.
Great point. I mean, it has to be feasible. It has to be applicable. It has to be tailored to sites. Those are great points. Elise, I don't know if you wanted to touch on transportation biosecurity as well.
Yeah, we have one more slide there. I think when we think about transport biosecurity, there's two sides of the transport biosecurity bucket. There's the side of the drivers and the trailers and those coming to the sites clean. I think Travis is going to talk about that in just a second. The new thing that we've started to focus on with our sites is the employee or the farm side of transport biosecurity. Unfortunately, a lot of finishing sites are not designed similar to sow farms to have transport biosecurity in mind. So it can be difficult to have a clear, clean, dirty line. A lot of chutes on the finishing side aren't all covered. They might not be all enclosed. They probably aren't all heated. They may or may not have a drain at the bottom to actually wash and disinfect them after market movement. So those are the things that we're starting to work with our clients and producers on, is to not let how to find little things that we can do to make that whole process better. And how to actually get cleaning and sanitation done. The other thing, sow farms, it's becoming pretty common throughout the industry, or at least more readily used to do stage loading practices, where you have multiple people participating in the transport event, and you have multiple locations of clean, dirty lines, so that you can add hygiene and sanitation, so that if that trailer does come to the site dirty and we do get PD or PRRS in the chute, then maybe we have a chance to actually wash and disinfect it and change clothes of the person that came in contact with that. And maybe we have a chance to not infect the pigs. We're a long way from that being practical and feasible on the finishing side today. So really just we're really starting at the front end on how do we get the system designed properly to add some of those steps in place and to do a few of those things.
I want to pose a question to the group, but before I do, I just want to remind the audience that if you have any questions for our panel today, you can post them in the Q&A or comments box of your viewing screen. There's been some counter argument, and we've talked about what's logical and feasible it has to be a must there. But when it comes to biosecurity for these grow finish sites, if the same employee is visiting 5 to 6 sites per day, we'll say, is it realistic to shower in and out to each one, or are boot changes enough? Maybe the same could be said with feed deliveries and the rendering drivers. What can we realistically expect of them? What's a healthy balance there? What other strategies should we be examining? Paul, start with you.
Okay. All right. Just a response. The questions of shower 5 or 6 times a day or boot changes enough, that's a researchable question. That's the kind of thing that we're trying to answer with this program. And it's showering 5 or 6 times a day. A lot of finishing sites don't have showers on them. So even the question of looking for a non-water alternative, effective alternative to showering. And that might be able to help people as they go from one place to another, or are boots enough, that type of thing. So there's a lot of questions there, Ann, and that challenge that you bring up are the things that we're going to be looking at. We've got to look at those with innovative eyes and not look at these the way we've always looked at them. You can't solve the same problem doing the same thing over and over again. We've got to look at different ways to do things, and that's really the point of our research.
Elise or Travis, would you like to weigh in here?
Yeah, I think Paul made a great point there, both in that comment and one previously, that you can have the best plan in the world, but you have to have people execute that plan. So in our system, if there are showers at 5 finishing sites and you're visiting all 5, the expectation in our world is you would shower in and out at all 5 of them. But there's also several sites that don't have those facilities. And so you have to slowly degrade from a gold standard to what is the maximum protection that we can get given what this site has. And then that becomes the expectation, and a high enough expectation that we want it to be executable day in and day out, whether it's the same caretaker every day or a crew of caretakers. They can all execute that. And we know that the plan that's put in place is actually being executed.
Elise, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, those are all great comments. The thing that I would add is that I think it really needs to start with the site design, kind of like I talked about earlier. If we make these things easy and we make them, we set up the design. So for the shower, for example, if it's set up that you have to go through the shower to get in the barn, you're more likely to shower. And if the shower is clean and has material that's easy to disinfect and the water is hot and you're not really cold on the other side, all of those things, there may be a little bit of a cost to get those things when you first design the site, but those things would make it a lot more practical to do the 6 showers a day versus the situations where the shower is not ideal and you're uncomfortable at the end of the shower or while you're showering. So I think if we think about the cost of the disease as it relates to the site or the system or the owner of the pig, then you can combine that cost with your break rate that I talked about, like finding a way to measure that. If you can combine those things, then that can help owners decide, how much time and money to invest into your biosecurity practices so that you make the biosecurity execution more logical and feasible and easier to get done by those employees that are there every day.
Yeah, absolutely. It's more comfortable and easier for them to go through, and imagine less pushback from employees and staff. Paul, there's been some discussion over industry standard biosecurity practices, enhanced, and then targeted biosecurity practices. Can you explain each level of those and then where you see the Wean to Harvest biosecurity program taking the industry in these terms?
Sure. It's standard practices. Elise and Travis have done a great job of outlining standard practices, especially on finishing floors. So there's a standard that's applied to the industry. Maybe it's more termed as common practices that happen throughout the industry, trying to pay attention to biosecurity. When you talk about enhanced, that really gets into the area of the secure pork supply and the biosecurity criteria for the secure pork supply. What that is an effort by the National Pork Board to put together the standards by which producers can demonstrate their applying enhanced standards to their farms. They can actually demonstrate it. There are record-keeping systems. There are maps, layouts, checklists, manuals. There's example plans that can all be found on the securepork.org website. So in the event of a high consequence disease, let's say in the event of African swine fever getting into the US, it's likely that state and federal animal health officials are going to ask or require producers to have enhanced biosecurity on their sites. And the Secure Pork Supply is one way to be able to demonstrate that, to record it and to be able to demonstrate that. Then when you talk about targeted biosecurity practices, targeted gets into the very specific, what do you want to do for biosecurity as something happens, or before it happens, or even after it happens. A good example is movement of pigs. If we get into an African swine fever outbreak again, or any other high consequence disease, there's going to be questions about the movement of pigs from, for example, in control areas where state and federal animal health officials are going to put in movement controls and permitting. And they're going to want assurances that before those permits happen and before those pigs are be able to be moved, any movement in or out of those control areas, that those pigs are safe to move. And that means targeted biosecurity, targeted testing, and making sure that you've got in place what you need to have in place in order to prevent the disease from moving. A type of biocontainment, if you will. If you've got the disease on the farm, keep it there rather than moving it out with your pigs. So I think those are kind of the three. With our program, what we're trying to do is really trying to elevate, trying to raise all boats with the standard practices closer to the enhanced biosecurity that may be able to help every day on the farms. Again, it's trying to offer cost-effective, implementable tools that these folks can use on the farm to raise their biosecurity. You saw examples of it for biocontainment and bioexclusion, and even transportation. Our question with the program is, what tools can we offer that are cost-effective, that are implementable, that these folks can implement to raise those even closer to a standardized, enhanced biosecurity state? Because if they can do that as everyday practices, we're going to do better with the health of our pigs. We're going to be better prepared for a disease outbreak. And I think that it'll generate a lot of payback for the whole industry.
Paul, I want to stick with you because we got a question from the audience here is, why is so much emphasis placed on biosecurity? Weren't things that affect animal health not addressed? Environment, diet, vitamins and minerals, even air filters, in ultraviolet light to kill viruses coming in. Do you want to address some of the areas we're doing there as well in the industry?
Sure. So I from my perspective, that's kind of an illustration of, if you're going to eat this cow, let's eat it one steak at a time. Not trying to eat the whole thing all at once. We started this whole conversation about how complex the issue of preventing disease transmission. We use the term biosecurity, but let's use the term preventing disease transmission is, and ensuring health. And all of those issues, of course, come into ensuring health on the pigs. Not any argument with that at all. But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to focus our resources into one area that can have an effect, that can have an outcome. And focusing on these areas individually and putting them together in a total program is a way to address overall disease transmission.
Great points. Elise and Travis, I want to turn it back to you. Successful biosecurity programs rely on a series of processes and protocols. How do you keep your employees engaged and actively participating in these daily practices?
I think successful biosecurity programs have layers that rely on multiple mechanisms to kill bugs and viruses. We know that there's certain things that are hard for employees to do every day, day in and day out. So for those things that are hard to do, if we can have other layers in place as well. So if in case that one time that process wasn't done completely perfectly, then there's another layer in place that might protect us. So let me give you an example of supply entry. For example, when we look at decontaminating supplies that are coming into the farm, we have a lot of really good disinfectants that are available to us. And if that item is fully covered, if it's clean and then fully covered with disinfectant, and we have the right amount of contact time, that should kill almost all the bugs and viruses that are coming into the farm. But we know that you might get a lot of supplies in at once, or it might be hard to get that contact time. So there's things that might make that simple process hard to execute. So then if we can add another layer to that, like a certain amount of downtime for that item before or after it's disinfected, or some control of the delivery route, or whether or not that item was contaminated before you're trying to disinfect it, then if that caretaker that's at the site disinfecting that item as the last step before it comes to the farm, if that caretaker misses one side of the box versus all the sides of the box, then maybe all those other layers that are in place will protect the farm and keep those bugs and viruses from entering the farm.
Travis, do you have any insight to add there?
Yeah, and really, Elise did a great job answering the first part of that. The second is how do you get engaged in active participation in that, and the key to it is education and getting everyone involved in that process to understand why it's so important and why there might be two layers to a process like supply entry. You're not always in control of the health of the pig you get in the finishing world, but you can control what other bugs you bring in on top of that and make a bad situation worse. And sometimes it's helpful to have those examples to draw on and find some commonality with a producer that is struggling, and you can help them struggle less by not adding more disease into the farm. But really at its core, I think you've got to educate why it's important, and not just that it's another shower I have to take today. No, it's a lot of work on the backside that you're hopefully preventing.
I want to pose a question to the group here. If you're going to pick 2 to 3 weak areas in biosecurity that needs to be addressed across the industry and within your own system, what would those be and why? Elise, I'll start with you and Travis.
I think connections with other sites is a really big problem across the industry. There's a lot of there's a lot of connections, and you'd be amazed at how many people move between finishing sites, whether they're field staff or employees, or that are doing the day-to-day care, or their vaccine crews or load crews. There's a lot of shared people that move. So that's why there's been so much emphasis on those showers, and there's so much emphasis on how the downtime between sites. I think that's one really big one. Another big one that I've been talking about is rendering, just because of how hard it can be to compost. So hopefully, I'm looking forward to things that we could learn from the program that Paul's describing. If there's other ways that we can make compost more attainable, make it easier to do, use different technology like grinding carcasses or things like that could make it more logical and feasible on finishing sites versus always relying on rendering.
That leads into a question we just got from the audience, which I'll hand it to you, Lisa, or if Paul wants to take it. But for disposal of infected animals, what about shredding animals and dumping the remains in the manure pit on the farm site? They talk about microbes will eat the viruses and break down the animal material. What about doing tests on the bone fragments in the manure pit to see if they will damage agitation pumps and manure spreading and distribution equipment? I'm not sure which one of you would like to maybe tackle that one.
Go ahead, Elise, and then I'll pile on.
Well, I think those are great questions. I don't know if, I think some of those definitely need to be researched. Some of them would need to be evaluated. And obviously some of them we would have to look at our environmental rules and laws that we have to abide to as well. I know grinding carcasses, like I just talked about, is a practice that speeds up composting, and you can use much smaller compost bays and compost designs. So, you have to have the equipment to grind those carcasses, but that's a way to not require the big expensive compost that we typically think about or people bid when they start to look at that as an alternative.
So my pile on, Ann, is going to be that we're really trying, as the industry, we're trying to address that, especially focused on foreign animal disease and especially focused on African swine fever. We get into a high mortality or depopulation incident, we're going to have a lot of carcasses that we're going to have to handle. The National Pork Board and their checkoff money is doing that kind of research for African swine fever in Vietnam right now to try to figure out how best to handle carcasses, decompose, compost, all of those things, grinding, et cetera, doing that research real time in Vietnam with African swine fever right now.
Great points. As we kind of wrap up here, final thoughts. These increased biosecurity practices we discussed today, not only needed for domestic viruses, but foreign animal diseases. What do you think are some key takeaways we can glean from the latest high-path avian influenza outbreak, and how crucial do you think it is for the U.S. swine industry to step up protocols in this area? Paul, I'll start with you.
Sure. Quick comment on that. Swine Health Information Center is all about emerging diseases. So the question becomes, what the heck are you doing on finishing floors trying to address PRRS and PED and all those types of things that we have right now? That's not emerging disease. This is all about preparation for emerging diseases, for the next PED, for an outbreak of ASF. The lessons we need to learn from high-path AI or African swine fever in Vietnam all need to be applied prior to getting that whatever it is here. And so that's what we're trying to help with the pork industry, to be prepared for the next PED or an ASF outbreak or another high consequence disease.
Travis, your thoughts?
I think a big thing that we can do ahead of this is, and Elise had mentioned it before, is to continue to have good communication within neighborhoods, especially spots where you've got high pig densities, and keep those lines of communication open as best you can, and always be conscious of what your pigs may or may not have, and where you go after that caretaker's done shoring for the day, and what can you do to help limit the spread. As simple of a thing as it might be, just going home before going to the gas station and changing clothes and showering for the first time or again. But really, it's what things can you do to control what you can control.
Elise, any final thoughts?
I think one thing we probably haven't talked about enough on this webinar is the importance of transport, biosecurity, and washing, disinfecting, and even baking trailers, depending on what the movement is and what the risk level is. That's a huge gap in our industry. I've seen huge improvements with individual clients and producers that start to implement some or all of those steps. But the reality is we don't have enough trailers. We don't have enough truck washes. We don't have enough baking facilities today to be able to apply that across the industry. So that's another area that we need to continue to look for ways to innovate that and ways to reduce the risk without relying on that.
Great points. Our thanks to Paul, Elise, and Travis for joining us here today as part of the Global Hog Industry Virtual Conference Update. We do very much appreciate you being with us. A reminder that all sessions will be archived and available on demand if you would like to go back and view them later. Coming up, Dr. Jerry Shershin with the University of Minnesota shares his thoughts on the risk for ASF during the session, African swine fever, things aren't always as they seem. We'll see you there at 11:45 a.m. Central. Following that, we have Dr. Jack Shear with USDA APHIS to give us an update on ASF at noon. Thank you for joining us today for the Global Hog Industry Virtual Conference Update. For National Hog Farmer, I'm Ann Hess.